jeans, t-shirt, pair of trainers, walking along Buchanan Street on my way to Kilwinning. And as I walked along, I saw the stall, the Glasgow Friends of Israel, and I thought, I know, as someone who was a Scottish Conservative for 20 years, sometimes standing at a stall is not the most uplifting of experiences, and it's good when people who support your cause come up and say to you, keep going. So that's exactly what I did, and I'm before you this evening because of that. So a bit about me. I was born not very far from here in Paisley, so I'm a Paisley buddy by birth, but my parents made the very wise or dubious decision to move to Kilwinning when I was 1 year old. Now, I don't know how many of you know Kilwinning. Those of a certain vintage might have read for many years Tom Shield's diary in the Herald, where he would have little vignettes about Kilwinning on a regular basis. And one of those stories, which is entirely true, was that one day both Superman and Batman, who both, for the purpose of this story, can fly, Superman and Batman decided they were going to fly from New York to Paris. And they left New York, and Superman said to Batman, "Where do you think we are?" And Batman said, "We've just left, but I'll check." Put his hand below the cloud cover, brought it back up, said, "I've just touched the Statue of Liberty. We've just left New York." So on they flew, and then after an hour or so, on their way to Paris, and it was quite an unusual route they were following on the way to Paris, once again, Superman said to Batman, "Can you check where we are?" Once again, Batman put his hand below the cloud cover, brought it up, and said, "We're actually just above Berlin. I've just touched the Brandenburg Gate." Wow! Where are we? How far are we from Paris? He said, "Not long now. One more try." So once again he said to Batman, "Where are we?" Batman puts his hand under the cloud cover and brings it back up. "Where are we now?" "Kilwinning." "How do you know we're in Kilwinning?" "Someone's just stolen my watch." So I come with that very proud tradition of Kilwinning behind me, lots of Tom Shield stories that you can read in the diary, which you can still buy, I think, in Waterstones, and that really gives you a good flavour of Kilwinning. So from Kilwinning, I ended up going to Edinburgh University, became involved in politics then, a pretty miserable cause at the time. I joined the Conservative Party, the Scottish Conservative Party, the day after Tony Blair became leader of the Labour Party. I should have saw what was coming. I became an activist before the 1997 general election. I failed all my third-year exams at university because I was out campaigning there to ensure there were no Scottish Tory MPs. And then, in 1999, I started working for the Tory party, was sent to the Ayr Road in Newton Mearns to work for the then John Young, and of course, Ken McIntosh was elected as the Labour MSP. So, over a long period of time, it felt like, "Mark, there's a message for you, move on." Anyway, I just kept going, and was able, in 2014, to be very involved in the Better Together campaign to keep Scotland part of the UK. And it was a great privilege to work in that campaign with the very strong friend of Israel, Jim Murphy, who of course used to be the MP here. And Jim Murphy and I had a great laugh, had a really keen joint sense of humour through that campaign. He would then he would always tell me when he was doing his stalls, travelling around Scotland, he would know, he could tell when the red cords and the wax jackets turned up that Mark had tried to build an audience for him from some Tories for that referendum. After the referendum, I then worked for David Cameron, and then when, of course, he lost, I wasn't involved in the European election, ladies and gentlemen, when he lost that European referendum and resigned out of the blue, I was walking along Princes Street, my phone rang, number 10, he offered me a place in the House of Lords, which was an enormous privilege. Unfortunately, at that point, a pneumatic drill went off right next to me, so he had to repeat it, yes or no, and so it was this sort of farcical, Ealing comedy-like moment when I realised what had happened. Now, of course, they tell you at that point, don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone you've been asked. You've got to go through all these checks. That night, I got home, hadn't told anyone, opened a bottle of wine, thought, well, yes or no. 11 o'clock, my phone rang. It's the number 10 switchboard. I thought they'd made a mistake. He phoned the wrong person, but they were actually just wanting my tax details to make sure that I did pay tax. And then, very fortuitously, that same summer, off I went to Israel with Conservative Friends of Israel for a study tour there. And it was in Jerusalem that it became public that I had been lucky enough and privileged enough to be elevated to the House of Lords, and was able to phone my parents from Jerusalem to tell them that news. I'm not sure they quite believed me until they read it in the papers, but nevertheless was able to tell them. And it was, I think, really quite important to me that I was in the Middle East when I did get elevated to the House of Lords, because the Middle East is something that I had been very interested in for a long period of time. I was a historian at university, studied history, and had a specific interest outside of my studies in the Ottoman Empire, nationalism in the Middle East, and the long history of the Middle East over the past 2,500 years. So when I arrived in the House of Lords, a very wise person, there are lots of very wise people in the House of Lords, as you would expect, said, hello, you young whippersnapper, that's a great thing about being in the House of Lords. When you're 43, you're very young, and the average age is 69. So I arrived and was told the most important thing is to find an interest, pursue that interest, and make sure you take and build your own knowledge base. And that's what I've really done since September 2016, is focused on the Middle East, focused on Syria, the refugee crisis, Turkey, the politics of Israel, and also the promotion of Israel as a democratic state in that most tough of all neighbourhoods. And that's been very important, because I think everyone in this room is very aware that is a position that's constantly under attack. And once I've finished speaking about what I've done in the Lords, I want to move on to what I think is actually quite an important segue, and that is that the Balfour Declaration, of course, came from a Scot, Balfour, and I want to be able to speak this evening about Balfour's Scottishness, how that influenced the Declaration, but also then move on to why it is so important that you all continue to do all you can in Scotland to promote the State of Israel and ensure that there is a balanced picture in Scottish civic society, because that is, ladies and gentlemen, terribly important. So in the Lords, I have a specific interest in minorities, whether they be Muslim minorities, Jewish minorities, Christian minorities across the Middle East, Jews in Turkey, particular interest of mine, Christians in Iraq, and across everywhere. And one of the things I discovered at the beginning was there were regular debates. And some of these debates are hour-long debates. And the first one I signed up for was a motion put down in celebration of the Balfour Declaration in the centenary year of 2017. And what was interesting about that was there were so many speakers who signed up, we were only allowed 2 minutes each, because basically the time isn't enlarged, so the hour is divided by the number of speakers who were speaking. And I stood up and I did my spiel, and I thought that was all right. And Conservative Friends of Israel, as there are other organisations, do a little clip and put it up on Twitter, YouTube and all the rest. And I received an email from the Mill Hill Shul in North London asking if I'd come along and speak at their celebration evening of the Balfour Declaration. And they invited 3 of us, Lord Beath from Berwick-upon-Tweed, who's also a great supporter of Israel, me, and a non-political speaker as well. And they said, you can speak about anything you wish. And I decided, I thought it would be quite fun, maybe this tells you more about me than anything else, what I regard as fun, to do a bit of research and just find out how Lord Balfour's Scottishness had influenced the Declaration, and to investigate for myself, as critics of Israel will often say, that the Balfour Declaration was just a piece of politics to assuage America, to get the US into the First World War, and actually no one meant it. So I started to do a little bit of research. And as I stood that evening in North London, the first thing I thought is, well, this is very typically Scottish, claiming all the good things for Scotland and saying all the bad things come from the rest of the UK. And I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen, lots of you have those tea towels at home which have all the things that Scots have done, and then at the end it says, and the Englishman has whatever he has. So I stood in North London and said, actually, the state of Israel is thanks to Scotland. And that made me feel quite good to say that. But also, in so saying, I reflected what Lord Balfour also thought about the Scottish psyche, because in 1912 he said, we the Scots have got the kind of unassailable self-content which makes us perfectly indifferent to hostile criticism. We pity our critics, but we do not think it necessary to be angry. And actually, I think that applies to many friends of Israel as well as Scots. And the two small nations over the past 2 millennia have much in common. It is far easier to make this case, because Balfour, of course, was a Scot, not just any Scot. He was a descendant of King Robert II, no less. And I want to present tonight how I believe the genesis of the Declaration was not something confined to the corridors of power, put in place because of cynical motives, but rather it was shaped by Balfour's Scottishness. Because not only was Balfour Scottish, but he had a deep faith and a historically unique place where he understood that the forces of war created an opportunity for Zionism that could be properly recognised by the British Empire and her allies. And so for Balfour, diplomatic opportunism gave the opportunity for him to be able to put in practice the Zionism that he already felt strongly about himself. He did view himself as a Zionist. He had his second meeting with Weizmann in 1914, and he was able to ensure that Zionism was properly articulated because of the events of the time. Now, Balfour, if you don't know, was born in 1848 in Whittingham House in East Lothian, which is a sort of traditional, very large country house. His father, James, died when Arthur was 8, but his mother, Blanche, had a deep religious Christian fervour, which had a deep impact upon Balfour. Now, as most of you will know probably, at the time, most Scottish aristocratic families tended to be Episcopalian, and the High Church of England was where they worshipped and where their faith was based. But the Balfours, led by Balfour's mother Blanche, who came from the Cecil family, which is the sort of ultimate high-end aristocracy down south, she was in communion with the Church of Scotland, and the family were brought up as Church of Scotland communicants throughout their life. And the big impact that had, as I'm sure you all know, is that in the Church of Scotland at that time, and I'll come on to the Church of Scotland in more contemporary times later on, but at that time it was shaped far more, focused on the Old Testament, the Psalms, rather than the solemn High Church of England. Sundays were spent not just with the obligatory Victorian visit to the church in morning, but an afternoon of Bible readings with a special focus on Israel and the Old Testament. Interestingly, actually, Whittingham, the grand house in East Lothian, where Balfour was brought up, became a residential training centre for Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany from 1939 to 42. But that's an aside. Balfour's Scottish religion education was therefore far more deeply influenced by that Old Testament education than he would have had in a conventional Church of England practice. Psalms were more important than hymns, and very, very, very long sermons from stern Church of Scotland ministers were the order of the day. And if anyone is really bored, you can go into lots of libraries across Scotland and find book upon book of these 2 or 3 hour sermons that a Church of Scotland minister in the 19th century would have given. And there's huge historical context in all their sermons. So you had a young man developing, being brought up for high office, but who throughout that, Christian faith and a Christian understanding of the importance of the people of Israel was central throughout that preparation. And it goes right to the heart of Balfour's feeling for the unique position of the Jewish people in terms of self-determination with an absolute right to return to the Holy Land. In a speech, and I think what is important is Balfour didn't stop his support for Zionism with the declaration in 1917, but kept going right until his death in 1930, attending meetings, leading meetings. In a speech at the Albert Hall to the English Zionist Federation in 1920, he said that the case for self-determination for the Jewish people could only be viewed as exceptional and unique. He said, "Here you have a small race, originally inhabiting a small country the size of Wales, crushed between Oriental monarchies, its inhabitants deported, then scattered, then driven out of country after country, and yet maintaining throughout that time a continuity of religious and racial continuity to which there is no parallel." So Balfour had a historic understanding throughout this time and a commitment to the right of Jewish people to return to Israel. Balfour demolished the logistical arguments his opponents put before him in opposition to a Jewish state in Israel by focusing very much on that spiritual dimension of the right of return. And because he did that, there was a consistency in his belief that this was not something that just had to be managed in the usual way, but was something that had to be delivered because it was right, and it was a right of the Jewish people. He also saw, and this is quite unusual at the time, especially of someone of his class, because I think we all know, and sometimes in Britain, I think we pretend to ourselves that anti-Semitism seen on the continent was never really as much a part of British society. And in the 19th and early 20th century, it most certainly was throughout the UK and in common parlance. So I think it's important we always recognise that Balfour was relatively unique in his own abhorrence of anti-Semitism. And one of the things that made him feel very strongly was that the fate the Jewish people, the pogroms that they were facing in the late 19th century in Eastern and Central Europe, and the anti-Semitism which existed here as well. And as well as the Scottish Church's strong identification with the Israelites of biblical times, importantly as a Scot within the British Empire, Balfour had an understanding of the importance of the history, pride and religion of a small nation. In a speech on Scottish nationalism, he opined that Scots had often found it difficult to fit into the United Kingdom, but had used their ingenuity and special skills to further the British Empire, just as Jews had had to do in countries across Europe and the Middle East. But importantly, what he understood was that Scots had not faced this constant wave upon wave of prejudice as they had made their way across the British Empire. So he had an understanding that for Jewish people, returning to Israel was for many the only way to fulfill what was their sacred fate. And so, while witnessing the huge continental anti-Semitism during the 18th and 19th century, he was clear that this was something that, as he would have regarded, Christian nations like Britain owed to the Jewish people, and that this was a fulfilment of a debt that needed to be repaid. And, you know, you can easily see, therefore, why Balfour was so open to Zionism. He had his first meeting with Weizmann in 1906, a meeting which was set up by Balfour's own Jewish Conservative Association chairman, the appropriately named Mr. Dreyfus. And as an aside, during the Dreyfus scandal in France in the late 19th century, again, Balfour was one of the few politicians in the UK to take a very aggressive defence position for Alfred Dreyfus, who of course was being pursued completely unfairly because mainly of anti-Semitism. So there is this running through his whole life, a feeling of connection with the Jewish people, a feeling of a debt owed to the Jewish people, and suddenly in 1917, people who had not been interested in the Jewish people before wanted to use the opportunity of the First World War and a promise to the Jewish people as a way and a means to get America into the war. So if Balfour, I would contend, had not been central at that point in time, we just wonder, would that declaration have been made? Now, the declaration was made, and as everyone in this room well knows, Britain then let the Jewish people down for a very long period of time. And it's a huge stain, in my view, on our national psyche and pride that not only did we limit so dramatically the number of refugees who could get into Israel up until 1939, but then, even worse in some ways, we treated those who had survived the Holocaust in such a dreadful way in our continuing refusal to allow those people to seek refuge in their historic home. But thankfully, the people of Israel spoke, the people of Israel fought, and the state of Israel was established, not because of some generosity of the British state, but because of a wish to return. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, it's that state of Israel now that we as Scots, having looked at how a Scot was so central to the creation of an acceptance that there should be a state of Israel, that we now face a big issue. Because in Scottish civic society, there has been a huge change in opinion over the past 40 years. My parents were born just after the war. My parents would have always thought the state of Israel was an entirely positive thing. They saw the horrors of the Holocaust, the aftermath of the Holocaust, and that therefore convinced them that it was correct that the Jewish people should have a nation. And what I remember, even as late as 1990, when there was the Iraq-Kuwait War, the first Gulf War, there was an acceptance amongst most people at my school, in Coewinning Academy, as we all talked, as 14-year-old boys do and girls do, about the war, that Israel was a country to be admired because of its fortitude, its determination to defend itself, and the ability to see off an aggressor with his Scud missiles at the time, you might remember, like Saddam Hussein. And I can remember going to the corner shop and some clever entrepreneur had renamed some of the sweeties Scud missiles, and you could buy them, and it was the talk of the school. And there was an automatic, and this is the important serious point, feeling amongst people in Scotland that Israel had to defend itself. And what, unfortunately, we have seen over the past probably 20, 25 years is a gnawing away at that collective opinion. And now, through the use of many organisations and civic society, a feeling now in many communities that it is unacceptable to stick up for the State of Israel and that there's something not quite right about it. And you don't want to be caught on the wrong side of an argument round a dinner party table. And that's something, ladies and gentlemen, that the Glasgow Friends of Israel and groups like it need to continue to push back on. Because the great danger when you're in a position where you feel and know that you're in the correct position and you assume other people are a minority, is that they use organisations to try and form a majority view. And I say this as someone who's an elder in the Church of Scotland, and I think the Church of Scotland is one of the organisations in Scotland where there is a constant anti-Israel pressure upon ministers, upon congregations, to always just push it a little bit, to go from fair trade stalls to Palestinian fair trade stalls, to get speakers into the Guild from Palestine, people who want to talk about Palestine, people who do not want to talk about Israel, and no balance to the picture. And I think actually most congregations, first of all, don't want to be forced into a position to be taking a position on what are foreign affairs, but especially when one considers the strong link between traditional Christian Zionism and the State of Israel, it's even more shocking that those ties have been undermined over the last 20 years. And so I think it is very important that every opportunity is taken, and I certainly take them in the House of Lords, to take the position that Israel is a force for good in the Middle East, that Israel, like every other country in the world, makes mistakes. Of course it will. No country is going to do everything perfectly. But as a supportive and critical friend of Israel, we are in the best position to make sure that we do all we can to keep in place a democracy that's there, that stands up for minorities, that is there where people, irrespective of their religion, gender or sexuality, can live a free life in a way that they wouldn't be able to do in much of the rest of the Middle East. And actually, when you push back and when, you speak, as we all would, in a courteous manner to anyone who's out, maybe an equivalent Palestinian stall, or when someone approached, I'm a great supporter of the Edinburgh Book Festival, I go to any Middle Eastern book event, but there is clearly, at all those events, and this is something I spoke to the Deputy Ambassador from Israel about, there is clearly an agenda all the time to project a picture of a Palestinian victim and for there to be a neocon, whatever the adjective that can be used to present Israel as some unfriendly way. And there is a deliberate mix match of the Israeli government and the Israeli people, so they are seen as one. So people, quite rightly, just as people in this room, I am quite sure, have different views on President Trump. I am quite sure there are different views on President Trump. But we do not say, I do not like President Trump, therefore the United States of America shouldn't exist because it's a force for evil. And too often in the UK, people target decisions made by the Israeli government that they maybe don't agree with and apply that to the Israeli state. And so I think it is very important to push back on this. And something that I find very helpful when speaking to people who are of open opinion is to discuss with them not only what happened in 1947 and 1948 in Israel, but also to discuss with them what happened from 1935 up until 1970 in the wider Middle East, where Jewish communities who had been there for 2,500 years were pushed out by pogrom and by prejudice. And I had the great pleasure to meet with Edwin Shuker, who some of you might know, who is an Iraqi Jew who's done a lot to go back and work with the Iraqi government over the last 5 or 6 years to actually remind people in Iraq that there was a very significant Jewish population there for so many years that has been forgotten about. And where were those people meant to go? Where were they meant to go when they were forced out of Egypt or forced out of Iraq or Yemen or Algeria? Where were they meant to go? Those people were fortunate that thanks to determination, there was a state which would offer them freedom, opportunity, and the ability to rebuild their lives. And these people didn't receive any reparations for all that they lost or all they left behind, and they weren't allowed to take their possessions with them. They had to get out. They arrived in Israel, and of course we know the rest is history and what has been produced. So I think when people do push you, as they do, on what happened and it's terrible and the state of Israel, what would have happened if the state of Israel had not been there for those Arab Jews who were forced out of their countries where they had been for so many centuries. And actually, that most of those pogroms and forced exiles for those people happened after the Holocaust, which makes it even worse that everyone looked on and saw that happen and didn't react in the way that you would have expected them to. So I think I'm here this evening, more than anything else, to thank all of you for all you're doing to promote the Israeli state, to defend the right of Israel to exist, and the promotion of peace in the Middle East, which we all want to see. And we all know, behind the scenes, Israel works with all the Gulf countries and with other countries to ensure that as much as possible, peace is maintained in the Middle East. So I'm very happy to take questions from all of you, but thank you so much